Of prejudice and discrimination. I'm going to begin with some basic definitions. Prejudice is the deeply held negative attitudes toward a group, either minority or majority, and its individual members. So prejudice can go either direction. It can go towards majority group members or minority. Racism is an extreme form of prejudice that assumes superiority of one racial group over others. And as the graphic indicates, it compares prejudice and racism. Prejudice can be positive or negative, where racism is always negative. It's a belief that race is equated with particular traits and that some races have superior traits over others. Discrimination is unfair treatment of a minority by the dominant group. Now, in this image, it shows women being given unfair treatment by the dominant group, in this case men. I know that statistically, by sheer numbers, there are more women than men, for example, in our country, but from a position of power, women are seen as a minority group. Stereotyping is a labeling of a group based on distorted, exaggerated, or oversimplified images of that group. Old people get this stereotype label all the time. They are seen as not being able to understand new things or new technology or get off my lawn type of idea. Again, that's a stereotype that it's used that distorts or exaggerates particular groups. A hate crime is a criminal act motivated by extreme prejudice. And that can be against religions, it can be against races, it can be against sexual orientation, it can be against most anything. Functionalist perspective on discrimination, the focus is on the functional and dysfunctional aspects of prejudice and discrimination. The dominant group creates a feeling of superiority over minority groups, and this strengthens its members' own self-concept. So in a way, I guess that's a positive aspect of discrimination, though that positive self-concept comes at the expense of someone else. However, when minorities are exploited or oppressed, the social, political, and educational and economic costs are extremely high. Not just in dollars, the costs of protests and riots and destruction, but you also lose the potential. In economics, you either have or will learn about the concept of opportunity cost, the cost of what you've given up. And in this case, not allowing people to develop fully hurts all of society. So racism and discrimination hurts society, even the dominant group who's doing the racism and discrimination. Conflict perspective talks about how the majority uses prejudice and discrimination as weapons of power to control minority. The group that is being discriminated against are held down. And remember, conflict likes to focus on shares of resources, whether that's jobs or money or whatever. And discrimination is used to keep people in a lower position in that lower position. The majority does this to increase its own control over property, goods, or other resources. This is a picture of the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 against Native Americans in South Dakota. If you've been in my American history class, we studied that. There was the desire, even though the Native Americans, the Sioux tribe, were forced onto a particular area of land in South Dakota. When gold was discovered in that area, they were kicked out and forced onto a reservation, even poorer land. And when they seemed hesitant to go, they were eventually killed. Symbolic interactionism focuses on how members of a society learn to be prejudiced or not prejudiced from a very early age. We learn it the same way we learn about things like patriotism or any other concept. It's taught to us in formal and informal ways and subtle ways. We hear adults talking. We hear words used by our parents and attitudes displayed, and we incorporate that into our subconscious without even really thinking about it. It can be learned. Prejudice can be learned from family or peer groups, or even the language itself can reflect prejudice. And you may look at this image and wonder about what this has to do with what we're talking about. But for a long time, especially in Westerns, which were quite popular form of movies and television shows for decades in this country, you could always tell who was the good guy because he had a white hat, and you could always tell who was the bad guy by his black hat. And in our language, we have lots of negative words that around the color black. To be blackballed means you're kept out of some organization. To be blacklisted means you won't be hired. A lot of negative imagery around that. Real subtle form of prejudice. And this can also lead to this idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is an expectation that leads to behavior that causes the expectation to become a reality. You expect a certain minority group to be unsuccessful or engage in criminal activity, and then you treat them in a poor way and you deny them opportunities to be successful. And then those people that you've discriminated against and held down begin to resist that and may at times turn to criminal behavior, which then seem to fulfill that prophecy that you made to begin with. But people seem unable to acknowledge their own role in that cycle. This idea that if I expect someone to act poorly and I treat them badly because of that, and then they eventually act poorly, that doesn't mean that my prediction was right. That means I had a role in it. If students come into my room and I assume that they're always bad or they're always cheaters or they're not smart enough to do the work, and I treat them as such, and then students start to misbehave, who's responsible? Did I help cause that problem? Self-fulfilling prophecy, and a really important concept in this whole discussion. And that's your big show for today.